The Graeae by Anthony Peake. Gracious one, play. Your head is an empty shell wherein your mind frolics infinitely. She was not going to like this, not one little bit, Aidan thought, as the train slowly drew out of the station. He looked down at his forearm. Through the raw redness could be discerned a shape, blue in colour and ill-defined. He assured himself that as soon as the swelling came down, the clear shape of the Eye of Horus would be clearly inscribed on his arm, and all his friends would be so impressed. All with the possible exception of his girlfriend Claire, who was patiently awaiting his arrival at Euston in 3 hours' time. Claire would see this as a stupid, self-mutilating piece of male bravado, something that should not be expected of a postgraduate student. As he thought of her, he felt the dull pain as his body tried to cope with this new indignation. In hope, rather than realistic anticipation, he imagined his student nurse girlfriend going into Florence Nightingale mode and seeing the tattoo as a form of war wound, a rite of passage that all red-blooded young men had to go through. She would be sympathetic and suggest something for the pain. He knew that this was not at all what would happen. She would shout at him, certainly, and point out that this was a self-inflicted scar that one day in the future he would really live to regret, probably. Aidan looked out of the window. Lime Street Station drew away from him. The platform disappeared into his recent past, a journey to London, his anticipated future. This monthly journey from Liverpool to London had become repetitious but never boring. He always enjoyed that Friday afternoon feeling of looking forward to his weekend, of meeting Claire at Euston and rushing down to Covent Garden for a bottle of wine at the Crusting Pipe and maybe a meal. His PhD programme at Liverpool John Moores University had another year to run, and then they would make a decision about his future. But for now, trains were his second home. His thoughts of the weekend were rudely interrupted by the sharp hissing of the internal train doors and the appearance of a large white suitcase, followed by a tense-looking man in his early 20s. As with all regular travellers, Aidan liked to travel in a degree of privacy. Books tended to be the usual barrier to social interaction with fellow travellers, but a better situation was to have a table all to oneself. It was therefore annoying for him when the young man asked if the seat opposite Aidan was free. The young man then carefully and precisely placed the white suitcase between his seat and the one behind. Aidan couldn't help but notice that his new companion seemed very ill at ease. That's all I need, Aidan thought to himself. To avoid the dreaded conversation, he leaned forward and pulled out the book he had selected for the journey, a brand new copy of Charles Kingsley's Heroes. Ever since his childhood, this book had fascinated him. The images that Kingsley's writing had evoked in his young mind had never really left him. He looked at the handcrafted cover of this lovingly recreated imprint of the original 1903 edition. The leather was a subtle shade of beige, but it was the black Celtic patterns embossed upon the leather that made it so wonderfully tactile. He was so pleased to find such a treasure in a station bookshop. However, he was still puzzled as to what made him go into the children's section. Even more intriguing was that he felt the urge to spend such a large amount of money for a recreational book, however beautiful. He carefully opened it and began reading the first story. He was immediately taken back 20 years to his mother's soothing tones as she seeded in her young son a love of the classics. The narrative told of how Perseus and his mother came to the little Greek island of Seriphos. Aidan was transported back to the ancient Greece of his childhood imaginings. Aidan's inwardly generated image of the wine-dark Aegean scene was brutally destroyed by a sharp shudder as the train entered a tunnel. The lights went out. After a brief flicker, they came back on again. The train's horn let out a sharp wail to warn other trains of its presence. The wail echoed off the tunnel walls. Its banshee-like scream changed its tempo, turning it into a sharp, ringing noise like that given off by an alarm clock. The alarm continued, loud and clear, a clarion call to awaken from a deep slumber. A hand appears from beneath the cumulus softness, fingers clasping at empty air before finding the reason for their quest. With a sharp slam of the palm, crashes down the clock. Silence reigns. A muffled, deep voice emanates from beneath the mountainous folds of a large white duvet. I've had that dream again. A second voice, higher in pitch, answers in sleepy tones from the opposite side of the bed. Oh, Paul, this is becoming silly. There was a silence for a few seconds as Paul surfaced from the depths of the unconscious and acclimatised himself to conscious awareness. He sat up in bed and, after a violent session of eye-rubbing, turned to address his wife, still obscured in the depths of the duvet. He concentrated hard. What could he remember from the dream? What pearl of hypnos had he carried from the depths? Then he saw it in his mind's eye. A book was in front of him, and beyond that 2 seats, one empty and another occupied by a brooding, dark presence. To his right he could perceive glass. A window, maybe. Then it hit him. He was on a train. Slowly his wife emerged from the fluffy whiteness, her hand stroking his back. The same dream? She asked. Yes, but it's progressed. I am now on a train and there's something else. Like what? Came the still drowsy reply. I don't know. A book, I think. Yes, that's it. I can distinctly see a book in my hand. But that's not what's scaring me. I can sense a brooding dread and evil, and it's so close. Paul turned round and faced his wife. Searching her eyes for an answer, he focused his thoughts, demanding that they hold the dream image for a few more seconds. Sarah gave Paul that look that he had known for the last 10 years. A subtle cross between matrimonial and maternal instincts. She pushed away his fringe and stroked his forehead. Her touch soft and gentle. He knew that was what was going to happen next, more psychological quackery regarding suppressed memories and subliminal fears. Paul knew only too well the source of these ideas. For 5 years Sarah had slaved in various low-paying secretarial positions in order to support him through his law degree and subsequent articles. He had secured a position in one of the top law firms in the City of London, and it was now her turn to fulfil her ambitions. However, for her the certainties of the law were not of interest. She had always been fascinated by the inner workings of the human mind, and as such it had become as no surprise to Paul when she announced a year before that she was wishing to become a psychotherapist. Unfortunately, within months Paul had found himself becoming not the supporter but the subject of Sarah's studies, a situation he strongly resented. As soon as she began her sales pitch, as Paul termed it, he felt the usual rising irritation. He was not going to compromise his education and rationality by allowing his subconscious mind to be metaphorically prodded and poked by some laboratory rat. The usual argument followed. Paul was, after all, a trained lawyer. He evaluated facts and figures and made conclusions from received evidence. He did not make unsupported leaps of presumption, supported by nothing but subjective evidence. To Paul, this unscientific approach was what destroyed any credibility that any belief system beginning with a particularly apposite prefix psycho could offer. By now Paul had recovered from his nocturnal fears. The warm morning light was filtering into the flat, and the shadows of the night were melting away as the day progressed. He could tell that his response had again hurt his wife, and he sensed that this was not the last he would hear of it. However, a day at work beckoned, and Sarah was due at college that morning. Let's talk about it again tonight when I get home, he said, giving Sarah a brief peck on the cheek. This was but a truce. He thought to himself an hour later as he drove down Elgin Avenue towards the city. The University Refractory was about half full. This was not unusual for this time of year. Early October was the time for slowly getting into the swing of a new academic year. It was a time to socialise without the usual pressures of regular lectures and essay deadlines. Sarah was having a coffee break with her classmate Carrie. Although somewhat loud in her overall personality, Sarah had always found Carrie to be a thoughtful and constructive friend. Sarah had thought that this was the time to explain to somebody else her problems with Paul. For how long? Carrie asked, a trifle too loudly for Sarah's liking. About 3 weeks, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice down. As the refectory was fairly empty, Carrie's voice did what her name implied, carried. And these dreams, are they always the same? Sarah pondered Carrie's question. No, she replied, it's a little more like an ongoing TV programme. What do you mean? Well, each dream starts from the same place but finishes by showing a little more of itself. As she said these words, she noticed that her departmental professor had walked past carrying a steaming cappuccino. Sarah looked up and smiled. Dr. Perfredo smiled back, and gestured a request to join them. Sarah was more than keen for him to do so. Perfredo was a fascinating man. He'd started his career as a physicist, but at some time in his past decided that the workings of the human brain was a more fascinating subject of inquiry. Nobody really knew what had brought about this change, but a rumour had it that it had been a real road to Damascus conversion from the physical to the psychical. "How are you both today?" Perfredo asked, looking Sarah straight in the eye and holding her gaze for slightly too long. Sarah felt awkward and not a little strange. For no reason at all, she suddenly found herself blurting out the full story of Paul's reoccurring dream and the strain it was pushing on their marriage. She was surprised as to how willing she was to divulge such personal information to somebody who was, in reality, a stranger. Perfredo seemed interested in the dream itself. Sarah began to explain it, and as she did so, the professor seemed particularly keen on certain areas of clarification, areas that Sarah thought were not really related to the issue of how Paul could be cured of this problem. "So why does your husband feel that this dream is an issue to him?" Perfredo inquired as he carefully placed his drained cappuccino cup back in its saucer. Sarah explained that Paul's fears were rooted in a great sense of dread that he experienced during the dream itself, but more importantly, this fear leaked over into his waking life. The professor nodded sagely. After a short pause, he continued his questioning. "Is there anything strange about the dream itself?" "It is very vivid," Sarah replied. "Anything else?" Sarah felt Perfredo was searching for something that he could identify or categorise. She was all too aware that this was the academic way, and yet she felt she detected an air of rising expectation hidden beneath his calm exterior. "He feels that this person on the train, the person whose viewpoint Paul shares, is not him, not Paul himself. He feels that he is observing rather than participating. Does that make sense?" Perfredo nodded, both in agreement and for her to go on. "He feels like it's a television reconstruction of a real event. Actually, now I come to think about it, he has said a couple of occasions how the dream feels like an ongoing drama series in which more of the story is revealed with each episode." Perfredo leant forward and for a second was lost in deep thought. He nodded and began to speak. "This is very interesting. It has elements of a psychological state known as lucid dreaming. These dreams are not only vivid, but do have the qualities that you describe. However, it is the sense of dread that concerns me. I'm sure that these dreams are linked in some way to Paul's past. Possibly it is linked to a film or TV series he may have watched many years ago. I think that I can help." Sarah knew what was coming next, something she had hoped for ever since the dream started a few weeks before. "Do you think that your husband would be willing to be hypnotised by me? I can attempt to take him back to when he first encountered the situation described in his dream." Sarah knew that this was going to be a real problem for Paul. She explained her husband's suspicions regarding what he termed psychological quackery. What she failed to add was that Paul had a particular dislike for Perfredo's version of this quackery. She had never really understood why Paul's attitude towards her professor was so negative. They had never met, and yet Paul immediately seemed negative about Perfredo, disliking him even. Perfredo seemed somehow unaware of this, and although she could never recall ever discussing her husband with him. "I think that it would be best if you both came round to my home this Saturday afternoon, say 4 o'clock. My wife will be there and the surroundings are considerably more comfortable than my room here at the university. I'm sure that Paul will warm to me when he meets me." Sarah said that she would speak to Paul that night and see what she could do. "I really can help, you know." With this, Perfredo nodded at both women and walked quickly out of the refectory. "How strange," Carrie said as she stood up to leave. "I know," replied Sarah, "and I have a feeling that things are going to get a good deal stranger." I refuse. Simple as that. For Paul, the idea that some incident in his past was causing these dreams was a possibility. What he couldn't accept was that some weirdo psychologist could hypnotise him and take him back to an earlier part of his life. It was simply ridiculous. "I'm not going to his house on Saturday. You can go on your own if you like." As soon as he spoke these words, he knew that he had overstepped the limit. He felt bad about his insinuation about his wife's interest in Perfredo, and that they were more than simply academic. He knew from previous experience that soon as any tiff between them moved from the objective to the personal, that they were both on very dangerous ground. "Paul, I'm not going to argue about it. It's late and I'm going to bed," Sarah said with a flat and defeated tone in her voice. The door closed behind her, leaving Paul alone in the living room. He thought for a moment about following his wife to bed, but decided against it. They were both too wound up to have a rational discussion. He concluded that it would be best if they had a cooling off period of an hour or so. He decided to calm down by sitting quietly and listening to the sounds of London coming through the open windows. He thought back to something that Sarah had said earlier. Could it be that these dreams were a manifestation of something he had watched years before, a television series or a film? He delved deep into his memories and came up with nothing. He then thought about his own past. He had not travelled on a train in years, and anyway, this train bore no resemblance to any train he could remember. The dream was still so vivid he could visualise what he could see around him. He could see the book lying on the table in front of the train seat. It had a fascinating beige leather cover, but he couldn't quite make out the title. He could tell it was a single word, but that was as far as he could recall. Even thinking about his dream as a memory caused him extreme anxiety. He decided to try and take his mind off the subject and onto more pleasant things. Music, he thought, that would help. He sorted through the memory of his music player and selected an album from his own past, something from his early teens. Why this was so he was not sure, but he really felt he needed to hear the music of one particular band, Snow Patrol. As the soothing guitar-based melody of "You Are All I Have" and Gary Lightbody's plaintive voice filled the room, he allowed himself to float away. His eyes became heavy and the music drifted away as if down a long tunnel, the tune echoing in his head like a call from a long-lost past. He slept. Aidan stared out of the train window, anything to avoid his disturbing fellow traveller. He looked over the top of his book and out of the window to take out in the endless Liverpool suburbs. He looked at the serried ranks of similar houses, exposed from the rear and presenting their underclothing, the underclothing of washing lines, garden furniture and endless conservatories. What was it about this sun-starved part of the world that made people invest in such things, he asked himself. Probably the perpetual optimism of the British nation, he thought. His mind lazily perceived the new station at Liverpool Parkway flashing past as the train made the long leisurely turn towards Runcorn Bridge. As he looked over the silvery expanse of the Mersey estuary, a tune insinuated itself in his head. Why was he thinking of this tune, and who was it? As the voice then joined the melody, he recognised that it was the new Snow Patrol song. It was everywhere, so it was no surprise that it was reverberating around his head. What did puzzle him slightly was that the music sounded as if it was a long way away, both in time and space. As the song faded away, it brought Aidan back to this place and his place and time. He looked back at his book and continued accompanying Perseus in his pursuit of the Gorgon. Aidan had reached the part where Perseus was watching Medusa through the reflection in a highly polished shield. He imagined the burning eyes of the Gorgon fringed by a slither of hissing snakes. He shuddered as the image buried itself into his brain. The train came to its expected halt at Runcorn, disgorging and engorging itself with passengers. The carriage filled up. A young woman asked if the seat next to the strange young man was free. Much to Aidan's surprise, his fellow traveller made it quite clear that the seat was taken. Aidan was all too aware that this was not true. All he could assume was that the man was expecting to be joined further down the route. Crewe, possibly. Looking gingerly over the top of the leather binding, he saw his travelling companion looking him straight in the eyes. This extreme view swiftly melded itself with his internal image of the Gorgon's head reflected in the Perseus' shield. The stir made his soul run cold. The man's eyes were dead, black pools, empty of emotion or human empathy. He felt that he was looking into the eyes of death itself. He sensed a fear so raw, so visceral that his blood ran cold in his veins. His mind mingled the two images, and he saw, for a split second, the head of a snake, its tongue licking the air, poke out of the man's hair. Paul woke up screaming. He felt that his body was being crushed. A snake was wrapped around him, suffocating him. "It's okay, baby, I'm here," the snake said in a soothing voice. "No," Paul screamed, pushing the encircling serpent away from his body. He started back. He had expected scales, not warm feminine skin. He looked round to see not the thick, repulsive body of an anaconda, but the slim arm of his wife. He looked back to see not the slit eyes of a snake, but Sarah's deep blue orbs. "Okay, this has to stop," Paul choked. "What time does Profredo want us there on Saturday?" Come on in, Profredo said with almost exaggerated enthusiasm. Sarah looked at him with a quizzical gaze. This was not at all like the man she knew. He was excited, nervous and frightened all at the same time. He snatched at their coats and gestured for them to sit down. "Where is your wife?" Sarah asked, trying to calm the atmosphere down. For a moment she thought she'd asked the wrong question. Maybe it was Profredo's wife that was the cause of his agitation. "Oh yes, sorry about that. She's been called out unexpectedly. She's a midwife, and one of her patients has gone into early labour." Profredo slowly began to calm himself. Sarah noticed that he was fascinated by Paul. He was studying her husband with an academic interest, but there was something else, something far more profound about the furtive glances. Did he feel he knew him from somewhere? She thought this, but then considered that this was unlikely. "I would usually offer you both a drink," Profredo apologised, "but under the circumstances I feel we all should have absolutely clear heads." Paul looked straight at Profredo. "Hey, I'm already nervous. You're making this like a scene from The Exorcist or something." No, it's just that we do not know what we may find out this afternoon, and we need clear recollections," Profredo stated as he walked across the room and pulled over the curtains. "I think we should start now." He gestured Paul over to a large red leather couch in the corner of the room. Sarah couldn't help but think this was so cliched as to be untrue. However, she was also very aware of the seriousness of the occasion, and her smile flickered only for a second as she watched the session begin. Profredo leaned forward and, speaking in an even and consistent tone, began to place Paul into a trance. Sarah watched with mounting excitement. However many times she had watched Profredo do this, it still remained amazing to her how easily he could dig into the subconscious and seemingly with little effort take people back into their own past. "Okay, Paul," Profredo advised. "I'm now asking you to go back into your past, back over the years to the time when you first encountered the person that holds such great power over you." Paul shuffled uneasily. His eyes opened and he looked surprised. "Paul, where are you exactly?" "Paul, where are you exactly?" Aidan sat bolt upright. He had suddenly heard a voice asking a very specific question. His heart still beating wildly from the snake hallucination, this was all he needed. Voices in his head? Was he developing schizophrenia or something? He looked around the train, hoping to see that the others were also reacting to a disembodied question. Nobody seemed to be reacting in any way. Even the man opposite, although still looking very threatened, had not changed his overall demeanour. Aidan stood up and looked at the seat behind him. An elderly lady was happily knitting. No, he thought to himself, it was not her. "Paul, where are you now?" the voice asked again. This time there was no mistaking it. Aidan was quite sure that he was suffering from some form of oral hallucination. The voice felt like one of his own thoughts, as if part of his own personality had detached itself from his control and was acting independently, and with its own motivations. What should he do? He concentrated extremely hard and mentally shouted the words, "Who the hell are you?" He waited. It was clear to him that whatever his presence was, it seemed to be surprised by his reply. There was a silence for a few seconds, and then the voice came back again. "You are Paul, aren't you?" Aidan simply could not understand the question. Here was one of his own thoughts. It had to be his own because it sounded like his own regular inner voice, asking if he was somebody else. It was like answering a wrong number on a mobile phone to find your own voice on the line. He again focused on the part of his mind that was still controlled by him and thought his reply. "No, I'm not Paul, and what, may I ask, are you doing in my head?" Again there was a short delay. Aidan waited. This was now becoming more than a little scary. He was psyched up enough by the character opposite, and now this curious turn of events. What's going on, he thought to himself. We're asking ourselves the same question, came the unbidden reply. The word "we" concerned Aidan a lot. Ideas of multiple personality disorder and other horrors flitted through the part of his brain not open to communication. He had no option but to continue with this crazy conversation. My name is Aidan, not Paul. There is no Paul here, at least not in my head. Would you like me to ask any of my fellow passengers that they have a Paul in their heads? Passengers, came the reply. Yes, passengers. Can't you see that I'm on a train travelling to London? Say again. Evidently Aidan's inner daemon could not see anything at all, nor perceive any of his senses. Whatever this being was, it was totally unaware of what was going on. I said, I'm on a train going to London. By now Aidan was finding this dual psychological state quite confusing. He was conducting a conversation with a being, or as was implied, a group of beings, which were located somewhere else. He looked around the carriage again. His fellow passengers were acting totally normally whilst his world, and everything he had come to believe in as real, was falling apart. What year is it? His new friend asked from nowhere. 2006, Aidan thought, suspecting that things were about to become very strange indeed. And the date? 5th of May. So for you it's the 5th of May 2006? Perfredo asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Paul nodded. The atmosphere within the room was absolutely electric. Sarah looked at Perfredo. She felt the amusement etched upon her face. She couldn't help but look at the large calendar on the wall, a calendar that clearly read Saturday the 11th of October 2025. Perfredo took a sharp intake of breath and spoke precisely and clearly to the deeply hypnotised lawyer. We will get back to you, Aidan. With that, he snapped his fingers and brought Paul out of the trance state and into his everyday consciousness. Paul's eyes opened and he looked round the room. He could tell from the looks on the faces around him that something very strange had taken place. 5 minutes later, he knew that this was the case. You're trying to tell me that there's somebody inside my head that's not me? No, replied Perfredo. It's more like you're acting as a medium. Paul was clearly upset by this. What, like some weird old woman who talks to spirits? No, more like a medium in its scientific sense. You're like a tool, a conductor, if you like, by which communication takes place. What is happening here is that somehow we're able to use you as a form of receiver by which we can speak to somebody in the past. Paul blinked with visible disbelief. It was bad enough to have one's conscious awareness wiped away by an extremely influenced trance state, but this was worse. To be seen as a cipher, something so bizarre as to be insane, was clearly too much for his rational mind. This is simply unbelievable, Paul blurted out. He saw that his wife's embarrassment was tangible, but Perfredo was much more controlled. Looking the confused lawyer straight in the eyes, the psychologist spoke with precise and controlled tones. Paul, one of two things must be taking place here. Either we have a case of multiple personality disorder, or we are, in a very real way, communicating with the past. Sarah glanced across at the computer located in the far side of the room. It was clear to her that her husband and the professor were thinking the same thing. They needed to find out what took place on May the 5th, 2006. 5 minutes later, they knew. What should we do? Paul looked Perfredo straight in the eyes. Sarah knew that her husband's legal mind was evaluating the implications of inaction. For him, to know that a crime was about to take place and do nothing was accessory before the fact. Indeed, she thought on this for a second and came to the swift conclusion that it was, in this case, also accessory after the fact. For her, it was simply an issue of morality. To know that people were going to die and not do something was morally unacceptable. She turned away from the computer screen and addressed nobody in particular to make her point. We have to do something. We have the power, she gulped. Yes, Perfredo replied, we do. But with power comes responsibility. If we take action now, we will most certainly change the past. People who would have died will suddenly be alive again. Or more precisely, they will never have died. Imagine the changes that 65 previously non-existent people can have on events. An ongoing series of cause and effect over a period of 19 years. These people will marry, have children, meet people who and create people who in our present version of reality may have married other people. Oh my, said Sarah, some people may cease to exist. Not may, replied Paul, will. The lawyer's precise reply made them look back at the computer screen. There was a stark, flickering web page showing an old newspaper headline, a huge headline. It read, Train horror at Stafford Station, dozens die. They were all too aware that this was simply the hardest moral decision they would ever have to make in their lives. They knew that a terrorist bomb went off on the train that Aidan was sitting in. It was clear that the dangerously nervous young man that Aidan had described and that Paul in his dream state had found so disturbing was a suicide bomber hell-bent on destroying as many lives as possible. Sarah and Paul had suggested downloading a later edition of the newspaper to confirm that Aidan had been one of the casualties, maybe even a fatality. Professor Perfetto had strongly advised that to know who had actually died would be the wrong thing to do. She suggested that it would make it less traumatic of all concerned if the events were kept as objective as possible. Sarah had found his advice rather strange, but could see the logic. She accepted that if they did take action and change the past, then some long-dead people will suddenly spring into fully formed life. They will appear as if out of nowhere, looking 19 years older. She reflected on this, and it made her shudder. She realised that it would be far more complex than that. From the point of view of the resurrectee, nothing had changed. They will have been around and perceiving events for all those years, but in what universe? Evidently not this one. As such, the temptation to find a name and then trace the person would be so tempting, if only to understand how it had been for them. No, she found herself agreeing fully with the professor, better to remain ignorant. So are we in concurrence? Perfetto asked. Paul and Sarah nodded to show that they would do as agreed. Sarah knew that for one more time she had to witness her husband's regression back to the mind of a younger man 19 years before, and then to never mention the event to anybody outside the room. The late afternoon light spread from a chink in the curtains, the motes dancing as the three figures moved across the room. Paul settled himself down on the couch. Perfetto began his pre-hypnotic preparations. In sharp contrast to the last session, Paul was positive and focused as he listened intently to the repetitious drone of Perfetto's voice. Slowly Paul drifted out of consciousness into his second deep trance state of the afternoon. Aidan jumped out of his skin with fright. At least with a phone call you hear the ring before the voice. This new form of communication was shredding his nerves. For him it had only been a minute or so between communication. He had naively assumed that his daemon interrogator would be some time before it came back to him. Indeed, he had hoped that it would never come back. The voice had been busy, it seemed. Very busy. We now know what happened. Aidan was confused by the use of tense. Happened implies something in the past, and yet as far as he was aware, nothing had happened in the short time between communications. Please be calm and do not react in any way to what I'm about to tell you, the voice said carefully and precisely. Aidan's heart began to pound again, trying hard to crash out of his chest and hide in a warm, dark place where disembodied voices did not give what was obviously going to be bad news. Just before Stafford Station, a bomb will go off in your train. As far as we can tell, it was a suicide bombing, and we suspect that your travelling companion is that suicide bomber. Hold on a minute, Aidan thought spoke. How do you know about something that is yet to happen? What the voice said in reply made Aidan really worry for his sanity. Because for us, the events have already happened. The voice stopped for a few seconds, giving Aidan time to take in the gravity of what it had just said. It then continued. We are in communicating with you from the year 2025. We know these events took place because there are records for them in front of us. Oh my God, Aidan thought. This simply cannot be happening. Not to me, not today. I'm sorry, my friend, but it is. And only you can do something to change our history and your future. Aidan felt for the voice. For some reason it was desperately trying to take some form of action. He knew this to be the case. He again reflected on how the voice was so familiar, how he felt that it was an integral part of him, not an external existence. Was it part of his own mind? A higher part, maybe? A part that knew his own future? Aidan had heard this kind of thing, of warnings of disaster given by disembodied voices or dreams. Was this the voice of his guardian angel? The voice came back again, sounding even more pleading. Aidan, you're the only person that knows that these events are going to happen. You can save 65 people from oblivion. 65 lives that in our version of the future do not exist. Please help me put things right. Okay, thought Aidan, I'll do what I can. With that, Aidan felt the presence leave his consciousness. He became a unitary being again, a unitary being with a purpose. He recalled a story by his favourite writer, Jorge Borges, The Garden of the Forking Paths. This had always fascinated him. It proposed that we all exist in our own version of reality, and that each choice we make creates another version of reality in which one version of our consciousness continues to exist. However, alternative versions of ourselves continue also to exist, living the outcomes of other decisions. Could this be what was happening here, he thought? Could these people be communicating with him from an alternative future, a future that may not even exist in his universe? He was brought back with a jolt when he realised he was running out of time. He recalled what the voice said, and it was specific, that the bomb would go off just before Stafford Station. He looked out of the window. He saw Winsford Station flash past in a shudder of backdrafted air. He realised that the train would arrive in Stafford in about 20 minutes. He had 20 minutes to decide what to do. He reflected on what the voice had said, that he alone could save dozens of lives, including his own. He could hear the happy conversations around him, of conversations on mobile phones, the sibilant chatter of personal stereos, and the hissing sounds of the automatic doors. All these people, all with a future, will be wiped out, denied a future, if he does nothing. A movement caught his attention. The man opposite was fiddling with his mobile phone. Oh my God, Aidan thought. The voice got it wrong. In this universe, the bomb goes off before we reach Crewe. The man glanced over. The nervous eyes again locked on Aidan, like a heat-seeking missile searching for a contratrail. Aidan felt the man's determination mixed with his fear in an apocalyptic cocktail of emotions. Was he going to do it now? Aidan looked past the man towards the emergency cord. He considered his chances of getting to it before the explosion ripped through the train. But to what advantage? The very action of doing so would simply make the young man detonate the suitcase. No, this was not the answer. The man looked away, and after a moment's hesitation put his phone back in his pocket. He had debated doing it, Aidan thought to himself. Something had changed the terrorist's mind. For now. The automatic doors opened. A ticket collector had walked in and began checking the tickets of the passengers. Aidan knew that this was going to be his only chance to do something. He calculated that he had a couple of minutes before the collector could get to him. He realised that to engage in conversation with the terrorist so close would be suicidal. He would have to get up and approach the ticket collector. With a bit of luck, his conversation with the official may be out of hearing range of the terrorist. A plan of action was needed and needed to be formulated before the awaiting cataclysm at Stafford. Aidan raised himself from his seat, trying hard to look as nonchalant as possible. He feared that his nemesis in the opposite seat would realise what he was doing. His heart was pounding so loud that he was sure everybody could hear it. His mouth was dry and he felt his limbs had turned to jelly. If this was adrenaline, he thought to himself, it's not very effective. He decided that he wanted it to look as if he was getting off the train. He knew that Crewe Station was about 5 minutes away now, as such that it would seem a perfectly natural move on his part, and not in any way suspicious. He purposefully collected his reading material, grabbed his overnight bag and negotiated himself into the aisle. What do I do? He thought. Is it natural to look at your fellow travellers as you're getting up to leave? Suddenly, what was normally a natural series of movements and social niceties became an obstacle course in which one stumble could bring about oblivion. With his blood pounding in his temples, he stood up, his legs pillars of jelly connecting him to the floor of the train. He forced one in front of the other and edged himself out into the aisle. Without a backward look, he picked up his bag, slung it over his shoulder and walked forwards towards potential salvation. Only a few seconds now, he thought, 20 paces at most. His heart played counterpoint to his footsteps. Then he was there, standing in front of his uniformed saviour. The conductor was in deep conversation with a seated passenger. Well, sir, whatever you say, this ticket is not valid on this route. Oh, hell, thought Aidan, this could be a long conversation. For many years he had bored whoever would listen with his opinions that the deregulation of the British rail network had been the biggest social and economic disaster possible. It dawned on him now that it might also bring about his death. The conductor stood aside, assuming that Aidan wanted to pass. Aidan stood his ground. The conductor gave a quizzical sideways glance to Aidan and continued the debate. Aidan then began to do something that he had not thought of before, to formulate what exactly he was going to say. Then it dawned on him. What could he say that wouldn't sound at best paranoid, and at worst totally insane? What would be his opening gambit? That a voice in his head had told him that the train was going to be blown up? A voice in his head, for Christ's sakes? How on earth was that going to be received? And then he would go on to say that this voice claims to be somebody from the future. He stopped his reverie there. It was not going to look good. Indeed, the probable outcome would be him probably bundled into the train, off the train by British Transport Police. He reflected. There he was, about to accuse a possibly innocent member of the public with potential mass murder. Could one go about doing that kind of thing? What evidence did he have? Tangible evidence? None at all. He could end up being sued for defamation of character. That is, of course, if it's possible to be sued when seen to be acting under the influence of hallucinations. He thought back to the vivid image of the snake crawling down the terrorist's face and realised that maybe, just maybe, this was a prelude to schizophrenia. He needed help, but from a psychiatrist, not from a ticket collector. He looked out of the window. The train was slowing down as it approached Crewe station. He made a quick evaluation of his situation. If the voices were right, this was his last chance to save himself. On a train such as there were no intermediate stops between Crewe and Stafford. If the voice were, as he was strongly starting to believe, a weird hallucination, then nothing was lost. He could catch a later connection and only be an hour late. He was sure that he could make up some kind of lame excuse that Claire would believe. He glanced back along the cabin. He saw a group of 60 or so people and the white suitcase awkwardly sticking out of the aisle. "Can I help you, sir?" the conductor at long last asked. "No, it's okay," replied Aidan. "This is my stop." "Well, what happened?" asked Paul as he came round. Perfetto looked totally crestfallen. Paul detected a tear trace running down his cheeks. The professor looked away and gestured towards the centre of the room. In the twilight, Paul could see his wife staring intently at the computer screen. "Well?" he repeated. Sarah looked up. "Nothing," she said. "The news headlines are unchanged." Sarah had somehow expected the newspaper to change the moment that Perfetto gave Aidan the information to save himself and the train. This was not the case. The disaster was still firmly placed in history. "How can this be?" Sarah said, looking directly at Perfetto. Perfetto looked at the totally confused couple and then spoke. His words were very carefully chosen, as if this speech had been rehearsed. "I think this may be something to do with the recently accepted theories of Professor David Bohm." "Who?" asked Sarah. "David Bohm. He was an American particle physicist who worked with Einstein and ended up at Birkbeck College here in London. Whilst at Birkbeck, he proposed a theory on the nature of reality that seemed, at the time, somewhat crazy." "I'm open to any suggestion, however crazy," Paul said, looking out of the window at the gathering twilight. Perfetto gave Paul a sideways glance and continued. "Bohm, like Einstein, was very unhappy about the implication of the observed behaviour of subatomic particles, the building blocks of what we see as matter. Experimentation had shown that these particles flitted in and out of existence and could be in two places at the same time. What was more confusing was that there seemed to be a form of communication between these particles that invalidated Einstein's proof that nothing could travel faster than the speed of light." "In what way?" Paul asked. "Well, an experiment in 1981 in Paris showed that this communication was instantaneous," Perfetto replied, "and it was instantaneous however far apart the particles were, even light years apart." "But that isn't possible, is it?" Sarah said, surprising herself with her ability to recall physics lessons from years before. "Exactly," Perfetto replied. "Bohm argued that at the smallest level possible, all observed objects link in some way. It may surprise you to know that there's a huge difference between the size of the smallest known particle of matter and the smallest possible size that physically exists, something known as the Planck length, and it is at this level that Bohm believed the linking took place." Sarah was puzzled again. "So how does this explain one particle sending an immediate message to another?" "Simple," Bohm argued. He suggested that the particles communicate instantaneously because they were the same particle. "What? How can they be the same particle?" Paul exclaimed. Sarah could sense that the truce between Paul's rationality and what he had recently experienced was breaking down again. Perfetto took himself over to a large whiteboard. On this he began to draw a diagram. Bohm explained it in this way, Perfetto said, beginning to draw a box. This box is an aquarium. It contains one fish. He drew probably the worst drawing of a fish that Sarah had ever seen. Glad to see there are some things he's not good at, Paul thought to himself. Bohm asked us to imagine that we wanted to explain to some far distant aliens millions of miles away what a fish was. In order to do so, they set up 2 video cameras, one facing the front of the aquarium here. Perfetto drew a small box facing the front of the aquarium, the larger box, as Paul perceived it, and another here. This time he drew the box at the side of the larger box. The TV images are then sent into space and picked up on 2 video screens on the aliens' planet. They see what looks like 2 weird-looking creatures floating in some form of liquid. They look similar, but they move in different directions. The aliens concluded that they are looking at 2 creatures, not one. Then a clever alien, let's call him Paul, notes that one creature moves in one direction, the other instantaneously makes a counter move. Alien Paul notes that there is a consistent relationship between the moves that suggests some form of instantaneous communication taking place. Perfetto turned away from the whiteboard and continued to speak. But the aliens still cannot explain the faster-than-light communication. Their error is simple. They never realise that the fish are not fishes but a single fish. And so it is with particles, added Sarah. At much smaller level of reality, they are the same particle. Correct, replied Perfetto. Like individual waves are all part of an ocean, so particles are part of a greater whole. OK, I can see the logic of all this, exclaimed Paul. But what has this got to do with what happened this afternoon? Perfetto stood up. He's doing a summing up stance, Sarah thought, knowing full well how Perfetto's lectures usually panned out. Bohm considered that as subatomic particles are the building blocks of matter itself, then all matter, organic and inorganic, is linked. He used the better term of enfoldment. He even attempted to explain how this could work, in a similar way to holograms, terming time and space itself to be something called a vast hollow movement. As such, every mind that exists and that has ever existed are linked. We all are, in a very real sense, part of each other. All we have done today is communicated through time using the Bohm's hollow movement. I can buy instantaneous communication through space, said Paul, but not time. That's a totally different thing. No, you're wrong, Perfetto interjected apologetically. Time and space are the same thing, as Einstein's equation showed over 100 years ago. Sarah sensed that Paul was starting to become annoyed. She was very aware of how upset the professor had been when it became clear that he had failed to stop the destruction of the train. For her and her husband, their day had been very successful. They had discovered the source of his trauma, and she was sure that this would be sufficient to exorcise the dream. However, she was now beginning to realise that Perfetto's objectives had been very different. She sensed that for him, success depended upon forcing Aidan to save his fellow train passengers. What she couldn't understand is how the professor could have known in advance what was to take place in Paul's regression. But for the moment she didn't want her husband to upset, because he was already an emotionally fragile. Didn't want her husband to upset an already fragile academic. She decided to involve herself into the discussion. Paul, I think what Dr. Perfetto is saying is that you and Aidan are like the fish and we are the observers, the aliens. She knew her husband well. He watched as a tiny glimmer of a smile appeared on his face. Within a second it was a broad grin. I like that. My fear of becoming treated like a laboratory rat has now been shown to be unfounded. In point of fact, I'm further down the evolutionary scale, a fish. A fish that can communicate with another fish across the years, Sarah replied as they both burst into laughter. Perfetto looked down at them both for a second. Then the infection took hold of him as well. He failed to laugh, but a smile did appear for a split second. Okay, I get that this is all now, Paul spluttered. His laughter subsided. But it doesn't explain why the events in the past didn't change anything. Who knows, maybe we were communicating at an alternate universe, or maybe Aidan simply failed to stop the incident. I wish I knew. I tried so hard to convince him that this time he should make the right decision, the professor said, more to himself than his guests. Sarah was confused. What do you mean, this time? Oh, nothing, Perfetto replied. He looked embarrassed, as if he had let slip something that he wanted to keep to himself. Sarah sensed that Perfetto had now had enough. He looked tired. It was clear from his body language that he explained all he was going to explain. What about my dream? Paul asked, putting on his jacket. I suspect that it will now cease. For whatever reason, your subconscious has fulfilled its purpose. Your day-to-day consciousness now knows why you had the dream, and as such it can compartmentalise it and lock it away. With this, Perfetto bade them a good evening and ushered them out of the door. Strange man, said Paul as they walked down Liam Court Road. I know, replied Sarah. I know. The room was now in semi-darkness. Perfetto walked over to the corner and switched on a large angle poise lamp. The light flooded the room, pushing away the early evening gloom. Satisfied with the level of illumination, Perfetto stepped up to his massive bookcase, a dumb testimony to one man's search for enlightenment, a search that had been ongoing for nearly 20 years. He ran his hands along the spines. His fingers enjoyed the tactile sensation of the books. He then stopped. He had found the reason for his quest. A beautiful bound volume, its beige leather luxuriating in the subdued light of the room. Perfetto lovingly took the book out of the case and carried it over to his favourite easy chair. The black embossed Celtic design weaved its mystical way across the cover. The middle in Latin script could be read one word: Heroes. He lazily flicked through the pages until he found the section he wanted. With precise enunciation, he vocalised the poetic structure of Charles Kingsley's sparse prose. The surge broke up in a foam, but it fell again, in flakes of snow, and it frosted the hair of the three Graeae, and the bones in the ice cliff above their heads. They passed the eye from one to the other, but they could not see, and they passed the tooth from one to the other, but for all that they could not eat, and they sat in the full glare of the moon, but they were none the warmer for her beams. And Perseus pitied the three Graeae sisters, but they did not pity themselves. A small glint of sadness and remorse crossed his face as he carefully placed the book back in its rightful place, a book that he had carried with him for 19 years as a symbol of his own survival and his failure to save 64 others. Maybe next time the eye of the Graeae will work and I will not be so blind, he said quietly to himself. Yes, there's always next time. He walked across the room and switched off the computer. The headline disappeared in a crackle of static. The sound of a key in a lock made him look up. A voice called out. Hello, Aidan. Are our guests still here? Claire entered the room and placed her medical bag on the table. Sorry, they left about 10 minutes ago. Sorry I missed them. Anna is fine, but it was a bit dodgy at one stage, Claire said as she gave her husband a big hug. Yes, they've gone, and so is the mystery of Paul's dream, Aidan replied. But the circle is still not complete, he cryptically said, as his wife poured him a glass of wine. What? Asked Claire. Oh, nothing, replied Aidan. He felt the Eye of Horus tattoo hidden under his sleeve shed a tear in silent collusion.